12-year-old Marcus walks to school every morning past the same homeless woman without knowing she's the mother he was told died in a car accident 5 years ago. What happens next will shatter everything he believes about love, loss, and the lies adults tell to protect children, revealing a family secret that will either destroy his world or give him back the one person he's never stopped missing. A story that proves love never truly dies and will make you question everything you think you know about sacrifice. The alarm clock's piercing shriek cut through the pre-dawn silence at exactly 6:15 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 1,125 days. Marcus Thompson's hand shot out from under his Chicago Bulls comforter, slapping the snooze button with the practiced precision of someone who had perfected this routine down to the second. 9 minutes. He always gave himself exactly 9 minutes of extra sleep before the real day began. In the kitchen below, David Thompson was already on his second cup of coffee, standing at the granite counter that had cost more than most people's cars, scrolling through emails on his phone with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had built his entire life around control and predictability. The coffee was Ethiopian single origin, ground fresh every morning. The kitchen was spotless, every surface gleaming under the soft LED lighting he'd had installed last year. Everything in David's world had its place, and everything was in its place. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. At 6:24 a.m., Marcus's feet hit the hardwood floor of his bedroom, and the morning choreography began. Shower, exactly 7 minutes. Teeth brushed, 2 minutes. Hair combed, 30 seconds. The same routine his father had established when Marcus was 7 years old. The same routine that had carried him through the worst period of his life without him even realizing it was supposed to be the worst period of his life. "Morning, Dad," Marcus called out as he bounded down the stairs, his backpack already loaded with the homework he'd completed the night before, his lunch money counted out and tucked into the front pocket of his jeans. At 12, Marcus had inherited his father's need for order and his mother's instinctive kindness, though he had no conscious memory of the latter trait's origin. "Morning, buddy," David replied, looking up from his phone with the smile he'd practiced in the mirror every day for 5 years. The smile that said everything was normal, everything was fine, everything was exactly as it should be. "Sleep well?" "Yeah, good," Marcus said, grabbing a banana from the fruit bowl and a granola bar from the pantry. "You know Mrs. Peterson is making us present our history projects today. Mine's on the Civil War. I think it's pretty good." David felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced every morning for 5 years whenever Marcus mentioned school, friends, achievements, any of the normal milestones of childhood that Elena should have been there to witness. Should have been there to celebrate, to worry about, to help navigate. "I'm sure you'll do great," David said, meaning it. Marcus was brilliant, focused, dedicated, everything David had hoped he'd raise him to be. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, David wondered if Marcus was too focused, too controlled for a 12-year-old. If maybe the structure David had imposed to help his son cope with loss had instead created a child who was afraid to be spontaneous, afraid to be messy, afraid to be anything other than perfect. "You sure you don't want me to drive you today?" David asked, the same question he asked every morning, knowing the answer but unable to stop himself from asking. "I'm good, Dad," Marcus replied, shouldering his backpack with the practiced ease of someone who had been walking to school alone for 8 months. "It's only 12 blocks and I like the walk. Gives me time to think about stuff." David nodded, pretending this answer didn't make his stomach clench with anxiety. 12 blocks through downtown Portland, past businesses and shops and people David couldn't control or monitor, past situations he couldn't predict or manage, past the park where homeless individuals gathered, where dangers lurked, where his carefully constructed world ended and the real world began. But Marcus was growing up, becoming independent, developing into the kind of young man who could take care of himself. David had taught him to be self-reliant, responsible, cautious, but not paranoid. He'd taught him everything except the one thing that might actually matter: how to recognize his own mother. At 7:47 a.m., Marcus stepped out the front door of their two-story colonial house, the house David had bought specifically because it was in the best school district, the safest neighborhood, the most respectable part of town, the house that was supposed to represent stability and security and all the things Eleanor had never been able to provide. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter as he walked down the brick pathway his father had installed last spring. Everything about their home screamed success, stability, normalcy. The manicured lawn, the flower beds that bloomed in perfect seasonal rotation, the two-car garage that housed David's BMW, and the Honda Civic he'd bought for Marcus to learn to drive in a few years. It was the kind of house Marcus's friends envied, the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. And for 5 years, Marcus had believed it was perfect. He'd believed he was lucky to have such a devoted father, such a comfortable life, such clear structure and expectations. He'd believed a lot of things that weren't true. The walk to Jefferson. Middle school took Marcus through the heart of downtown Portland, past the coffee shops and boutiques that catered to people like his father, past the office buildings where deals were made and fortunes were built. But it also took him past places David would have preferred he avoid. The community center where free meals were served, the park where homeless individuals gathered, the shelter that operated out of the old church on 5th Street. Marcus had grown comfortable with this route over the past 8 months, comfortable with the diversity of people and situations he encountered. His father had raised him to be polite but cautious, friendly but not naive. Marcus said good morning to the shop owners he recognized, nodded politely to the street vendors setting up their stalls, and maintained appropriate distance from anyone who seemed unstable or potentially dangerous. It was a routine that had served him well, kept him safe, allowed him to feel grown up and independent while still operating within boundaries his father would approve of, until today. Until the moment when his entire understanding of the world would collapse with a single glance. Elena Martinez sat on the same bench she'd occupied every weekday morning for 8 months, watching the flow of pedestrians with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read the rhythm of the street. At 34, she looked older than her years, worn down by weather and worry and the constant stress of survival. Her dark hair, once lustrous and carefully styled, now hung in a simple ponytail beneath a knitted cap she'd found at the shelter. Her clothes were clean, but obviously second-hand, layered for warmth rather than fashion. To most people walking past, she was invisible, just another homeless person taking up space on a public bench. But Elena saw everything. She saw the businessman who always bought coffee from the cart on the corner but never made eye contact with anyone. She saw the teenager who walked to school with earbuds in, lost in his own world. She saw the elderly woman who fed pigeons every morning at exactly 8:15. And she saw her son every morning for 8 months. Elena had positioned herself on this bench at exactly the right time to catch a glimpse of Marcus as he walked to school. She'd watched him grow taller, more confident, more independent. She'd seen him laugh with friends, struggle with heavy textbooks, stop to pet dogs that belonged to other pedestrians. She'd memorized everything about him, the way he walked with his head slightly tilted when he was thinking, the way he favored his left foot slightly because of an old soccer injury, the way he unconsciously touched his chest where a small scar remained from the heart surgery he'd had as a baby. Surgery she'd been there for, holding his tiny hand as he went under anesthesia, sleeping in the hospital chair for 3 days until he was out of danger. Marcus didn't remember any of that, of course. He'd been too young, and David had made sure there were no reminders of Elena's presence during that terrifying time. But Elena remembered everything. Every sleepless night, every prayer she'd whispered, every moment of terror that she might lose the most precious thing in her world. She remembered, and she watched, and she loved him from a distance because it was the only love she was allowed to give. This morning started like all the others. Elena saw Marcus turn the corner from Maple Street, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going and how long it would take to get there. He was wearing the blue jacket she'd seen him in several times this fall, the one that brought out the color of his eyes that were exactly like hers. Elena's heart did what it always did when she saw him. Stopped for a moment, then began racing as if trying to make up for lost time. 8 months of this routine, and it never got easier. If anything, it got harder as she watched him grow and change, as she realized how much of his life she was missing, how many conversations they'd never have, how many memories they'd never make. But today was different. Today, instead of keeping his head down or staring at his phone like most kids his age, Marcus was looking around as he walked, really looking, as if he was seeing his surroundings for the first time. His gaze swept across the park, taking in the small clusters of people, the vendors setting up for the day, the joggers beginning their morning runs. And then his eyes landed on Eleanor. For a moment, time stopped completely. Mother and son looked at each other across 20 feet of concrete and 5 years of separation, and Elena felt her carefully constructed world begin to crumble. She'd prepared for this moment, dreaded it, hoped for it, convinced herself it would never happen. But now that it was here, she was completely unprepared for the intensity of recognition in Marcus's eyes. He knew, somehow, despite everything David had done to erase her from his memory, despite 5 years of believing she was dead, despite the ways poverty and hardship had changed her appearance, Marcus knew. "Mom?" The word escaped his lips as barely a whisper, but Elena heard it as clearly as if he'd shouted. She saw his backpack slip from his shoulder and hit the ground with a dull thud. She saw the color drain from his face as his brain struggled to process what his heart had already accepted. Elena's first instinct was to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the streets, to pretend this moment had never happened, to protect them both from the consequences of this recognition. But she couldn't move. After 8 months of stolen glances and careful observation, after 5 years of dreaming about this exact moment, she couldn't force herself to look away from her sons. A face. "Marcus," she said, his name falling from her lips like a prayer. Even from across the space between them, she could see tears beginning to form in his eyes, could see his hands shaking as he tried to process the impossible. Marcus took a step forward, then another, moving like someone in a dream. The rational part of his mind, the part that sounded exactly like his father, was screaming that this couldn't be real. His mother was dead. He'd been to her funeral. He'd seen the death certificate. He'd grieved for her, missed her, built his entire identity around being the son of a woman who was gone forever. But his heart recognized her immediately. The shape of her face, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was nervous, the small scar on her chin that he'd asked about 100 times when he was little, the eyes that were exactly like his own, that had looked at him with such love in every memory he had of her. "You're supposed to be dead," Marcus said when he was close enough that they didn't have to shout. His voice was small, confused, breaking with emotions too big for his 12-year-old heart to contain. Elena felt tears streaming down her face, tears she'd thought had run out years ago. "I know, baby. I know this is confusing and scary, and you have so many questions, but you need to go to school. You'll be late. And your father—" "My father thinks you're dead too," Marcus interrupted, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "I have to call him. I have to tell him you're alive. He's going to be so happy, Mom. He's going to be—" "No." The word came out sharper than Elena intended, sharp enough to make Marcus stop dialing and look at her with confusion. "Marcus, you can't call him. Not yet. There are things you don't understand, things about why I'm here, why I haven't been home." But Marcus was already pressing the call button, his face bright with joy and excitement that broke Elena's heart into even smaller pieces. She watched her son's face as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before David's voice filled the air between them. "Marcus, is everything okay? You should be in first period by now." "Dad, you need to sit down," Marcus said, his voice breathless with excitement. "I have the most amazing news. Mom's here. She's alive, Dad. She didn't die in the accident. She's been here the whole time," and the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Eleanor watched the joy on Marcus's face begin to fade as the seconds ticked by without response. "Dad, did you hear me? Mom's alive. She's right here in front of me." When David finally spoke, his voice was cold, controlled, nothing like the warm father Marcus knew. "Where are you?" "Elm Street Park by the..." "Don't move, don't go anywhere, I'm coming right now." The line went dead and Marcus stared at his phone with growing confusion. Why did he sound like that? Why didn't he sound happy? Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 5 years of secrets pressing down on her chest like a physical force. Around them, the morning continued its normal rhythm. People walking to work, children heading to school, the city waking up and going about its business. But in this small space on a park bench, 3 lives were about to collide in ways that would change everything. "Marcus," Elena said carefully, "there are things about your father and me, about our divorce, about why I haven't been home, things that are complicated, adult things that maybe you shouldn't have to know about." "I'm 12, not 2, Marcus said, unconsciously echoing words he'd spoken to his father that very morning. "I can handle complicated. What I can't handle is everyone treating me like I'm too young to understand my own life." Elena looked at her son, this beautiful, intelligent boy who had grown so much in 5 years, and realized he was right. He was old enough to understand complexity, old enough to handle difficult truths, old enough to deserve honesty about his own story. But before she could decide how much to tell him, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. David's black BMW had jumped the curb and was parked at an angle that suggested panic rather than careful planning. David himself was getting out of the car, his face a mask of barely controlled terror and rage. Elena's entire body went rigid. In that moment, she wasn't a 34-year-old woman sitting in a park with her son. She was back in the courthouse 5 years ago, listening to David's lawyer explain exactly what would happen if she ever violated the restraining order, the criminal charges, the jail time, the complete and permanent loss of any right to see Marcus ever again. Elena. David's voice carried the same tone he used in business negotiations when he was about to destroy someone's livelihood. "You need to leave, right now." Marcus looked between his parents, confusion and anger beginning to replace the joy he'd felt moments before. "What's going on? Why are you talking to her like that? She's Mom. She's alive. This is good news." "Marcus, get in the car," David said, not taking his eyes off Elena. "No." The word came out stronger than Marcus had intended, surprising all 3 of them. "Not until someone explains what's happening. Why did everyone think Mom was dead? Where has she been for 5 years? Why are you acting like seeing her is the worst thing that could happen?" David's jaw tightened. He'd known this day might come, had hired private investigators to track Elena's movements specifically to prevent this exact scenario. But he'd underestimated his son's growing independence, underestimated Elena's desperation, underestimated the power of a mother's love to overcome even the most careful surveillance. "Marcus," Elena said softly, "maybe you should go with your father. We can talk about this later when we've all had time to..." "No," Marcus said again, this time louder. Several people in the park had begun to stare, drawn by the obvious tension of the scene playing out on the bench. "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me the truth. I deserve to know what happened to my mother." The word mother hit Elena like a physical blow. For 5 years, she'd been nobody's mother. She'd been a ghost, a memory, a woman who had once had a family, but had forfeited any right to claim them. Hearing Marcus say it with such certainty and defiance made her feel human again for the first time in forever. David saw the look on Elena's face and felt the familiar surge of panic that had driven all his decisions 5 years ago. This was how it had started before. Elena getting that look in her eyes, the one that said she was remembering what it felt like to be Marcus's mother. The look that had made David so desperate to remove her from their lives, permanently, that he'd been willing to do things he'd never imagined himself capable of. "Fine," David said, his voice tight with control. "You want the truth, Marcus? Your mother left us. She walked out when you were 7 years old because she decided being a parent was too difficult. She abandoned her family, and when she realized she'd made a mistake, I couldn't let her come back and hurt you again." Marcus stared at his father, then at his mother, waiting for her to deny it. To tell him that wasn't what happened, to explain that there was more to the story, but Elena just sat there, tears streaming down her face, saying nothing. "Mom?" Marcus's voice was small now, uncertain. "Is that true? Did you just leave because you didn't want to be my mom anymore?" Elena looked at her son, then at David, who was watching her with the same cold expression he'd worn during their custody battle, the same expression that said he held all the cards and she had nothing. She could tell Marcus the truth, that she'd never wanted to leave, that David had manufactured evidence and manipulated the legal system to force her out, that every day for 5 years she'd dreamed of this moment. But what would that accomplish besides turning Marcus against his father? David had clearly been a good parent to Marcus. The boy was healthy, well-dressed, confident, loved. If she told the truth now, she'd be destroying that stability out of her own selfish need to be vindicated. "It's complicated, baby," she said finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, big mistakes that hurt the people they love most." It wasn't confirmation, but it wasn't denial either. And Marcus heard the evasion in her voice. At 12, he was old enough to recognize when adults were protecting him from something. He was also old enough to resent it. "So you just decided you didn't want me anymore?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You just walked away from our family?" The pain in his voice was unbearable. Elena had thought the worst part of the last 5 years was not knowing how Marcus was doing, but she'd been wrong. The worst part was this moment, sitting 3 feet away from her son and watching her own forced choices break his heart. "I never stopped wanting you," she whispered. "Not for a single day, not for a single moment." "Then why didn't you come back?" Marcus demanded. "If you wanted to be my mom, why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you try to see me?" David stepped forward, sensing his opportunity to end this conversation before it went too far. "Because she knew she couldn't take care of you the way you deserved. She knew you were better off without her." The cruelty of it took Elena's breath away. David was using her love for Marcus as a weapon against her, just like he had 5 years ago. He knew she would endure any amount of pain rather than hurt their son, and he was counting on that knowledge to make her disappear again. But something had changed in Elena during her years on the street. She'd learned to survive things she'd never imagined she could endure. She'd found strength in places she didn't know existed. And looking at Marcus now, seeing the desperate need in his eyes to understand his own story, she realized that protecting him from the truth might not be protection at all. "That's not exactly what happened," she said quietly. David's face went white. "Eleanor, don't!" "Marcus," she continued, ignoring David's warning tone, "has your father ever told you why we got divorced?" "You fought a lot," Marcus said, reciting what he'd been told years ago. "You weren't happy together. You wanted different things." "That's true," Elena acknowledged. "We did fight a lot, but do you know what we fought about?" David was pulling out his phone now, probably calling his lawyer. Elena had maybe 2 minutes before this conversation was forcibly ended, and she had 5 years' worth of truth to share. "We fought about you," she said quickly, "about what was best for you. Your father thought you needed structure, discipline, a certain kind of life. I thought you needed freedom to be yourself, to make mistakes, to figure out who you were without someone constantly telling you who you should be." Marcus looked between his parents, beginning to see them not as the unified front he'd always imagined, but as 2 people who'd fundamentally disagreed about how to love him. "The fights got worse after I lost my job," Elena continued, speaking faster now as David approached them. I was a teacher at Roosevelt Elementary, and budget cuts meant they had to let several of us go. Your father said I was irresponsible, that I couldn't provide for you the way he could, and he was right. Financially, I couldn't. So when he suggested that you'd be better off living with him full-time, I agreed to let him have primary custody. But that's not the same as leaving, Marcus pointed out. Other kids have divorced parents who both love them. They visit back and forth. Elena smiled sadly. You're absolutely right. It's not the same at all. Elena, stop! David was right behind her now, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. The same cologne he'd worn throughout their marriage, the one that used to make her feel safe and now made her stomach turn with anxiety. Marcus, get in. The car. This conversation is over. No, it's not, Marcus said, standing up to face his father. Even at 12, he was almost as tall as Elena, and she could see David in the stubborn set of his shoulders. I want to know why Mom really left. Not the easy version you've been telling me. David looked at his son, this boy who had somehow grown up when he wasn't paying attention, who was asking questions David had hoped he'd never have to answer, and felt the careful structure of his lies beginning to collapse. The truth was, David had never intended for things to go as far as they had. In the beginning, he just wanted Elena to understand that she couldn't provide for Marcus the way he could. He'd wanted her to see that their son deserved better than a mother who'd been laid off from her teaching job and was struggling to find new work. A mother who sometimes cried in the bathroom when she thought no one was looking. A mother who occasionally snapped at Marcus when the stress of unemployment became too much. But Elena had been stubborn, insisting that she could turn things around, that losing her job didn't make her a bad mother. She'd started dating someone, a kind, gentle man who worked at the community center and seemed to genuinely care about both her and Marcus. And David had seen, read, the idea of another man raising his son, of Marcus having a father figure who might be more understanding, more patient, more emotionally available than David himself had driven him to take actions he'd never thought himself capable of. Your mother, David said carefully, choosing his words like weapons, made some choices that put you at risk. I had to protect you. What kind of choices? Marcus demanded. Elena laughed bitterly. I started dating someone your father didn't approve of. According to him, that put you in mortal danger. That's not, David began, but Marcus cut him off. You had her taken away because she was dating someone? The disbelief in Marcus's voice was devastating. That's why she left? Because you didn't like her boyfriend? It's more complicated than that, David said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. No, Marcus said, his voice getting louder, drawing more attention from passers-by. It's not complicated. You got jealous, so you found a way to make Mom disappear. And then you told me she was dead. The accusation hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Elena watched her son process the magnitude of what his father had done, and her heart broke all over again. This was what she'd tried to prevent by staying away. This moment when Marcus would have to choose between the two people who were supposed to love him most. I never said she was dead, David said defensively. I said she was gone. You were the one who assumed the funeral, Marcus interrupted, his voice cracking with emotion. I remember the funeral. There was a casket. People brought flowers. Mrs. Chen from next door made that tuna casserole you hate. I threw dirt on the grave, Dad. I threw dirt on what I thought was my mother's grave. David's face went gray. In the immediate aftermath of Eleanor's forced disappearance, when Marcus had been inconsolable and kept asking when Mommy was coming home, David had made a decision that seemed merciful at the time. He told Marcus that his mother had been in an accident, that she was in heaven now, that she wasn't in pain anymore. The fake funeral had been David's sister's idea. Caroline had argued that Marcus needed closure, needed a way to say goodbye. They'd filled a casket with some of Elena's belongings, clothes, jewelry, books, photos, and held a small service at the funeral home. Marcus had been 7 years old, too young to understand that no one else seemed to know the deceased, too overwhelmed by grief to notice that there was no body to view. "You buried her clothes," Marcus said slowly, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "You made me think she was dead, and you buried her clothes and her books, and made me say goodbye to a box full of stuff." The horror in his son's voice made David want to disappear. In the 5 years since Elena had been forced out of their lives, he'd managed to convince himself that what he'd done was justified. Marcus had been happy, successful in school, well-adjusted. The fake death had given him closure, allowed him to move on in a way that a messy custody battle never would have. But now, seeing the betrayal in Marcus's eyes, David realized he'd been lying to himself as much as to his son. "I thought it was better," he said weakly. "I thought it would hurt less than knowing she'd chosen to leave." "Better?" Marcus's voice broke completely. "You thought it was better for me to believe my mother was dead than to know she was alive and wanted to see me." Elena reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort her son, but stopped herself. She had no right to touch him, no right to offer comfort for pain she'd played a role in causing. Even if David had manipulated the situation, even if she'd had no good choices, she'd still chosen to stay away. She'd chosen to let Marcus believe she was dead rather than fight for him in ways that might have caused him different kinds of pain. "Marcus," she said softly, "your father did what he thought was right. And maybe he was right. Maybe you were better off without me." "No!" Marcus turned to face her fully, and Elena was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "Don't you dare! Don't you dare stand there and tell me I was better off thinking you were dead. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Do you have any idea how many times I wished I could talk to you just once more?" The pain in his voice was unbearable, but Elena forced herself to listen to every word. She owed him that much. "I used to have dreams about you," Marcus continued, tears streaming down his face. "Dreams where you came back and told me it was all a mistake, that you weren't really gone. And I'd wake up and remember that you were dead, and it felt like losing you all over again. Every single time." Elena felt something break inside her chest. For 5 years, she told herself that Marcus was better off without her, that David could give him things she never could. She'd convinced herself that her son was happy, that he'd moved on, that her absence was just a sad memory rather than an ongoing source of pain. She'd been wrong about everything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, baby. I hoped." "You hoped what?" Marcus demanded. "You hoped I'd just forget about you? You hoped losing my mother wouldn't matter because I had everything else?" Around them, the park had grown quiet. Even the joggers had stopped, drawn by the raw emotion of the scene playing out on the bench. But Elena, David and Marcus were lost in their own world of pain and regret and love that had never really died. "I hoped you'd be happy," Elena said simply. "That's all I ever wanted, for you to be happy." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could see him struggling with emotions too big for his 12-year-old heart to contain. Love and anger and grief and hope, all warring for dominance. "I wasn't happy," he said finally. "I was never happy. I just got good at pretending." The admission devastated both his parents in different ways. For Eleanor, it was confirmation that her sacrifice had been meaningless, that all her pain had been for nothing. For David, it was the realization that his careful construction of Marcus's perfect life had been built on a foundation of lies that had hurt his son in ways he'd never imagined. "Marcus," David said, his voice broken, "I never meant for you to be sad. Everything I did because I love you." "No," Marcus said, whirling to face his father. "Everything you did because you couldn't stand the idea of sharing me. You couldn't stand that Mom might make me happy in ways you couldn't. So you made her disappear and then lied to me about it for 5 years." The accuracy of the accusation left David speechless. How could his 12-year-old son see so clearly what he'd spent 5 years trying to hide from himself? "And you," Marcus continued, turning back to Elena, "you let him. You let him. Tell me you were dead, and you never even tried to contact me. What kind of mother does that?" Elena flinched as if she'd been slapped. The kind who was told that if she ever tried to see her son again, she'd be arrested and charged as an unfit mother. The kind who was made to believe that her child was better off without her. The kind who loved you so much that she was willing to let you hate her if it meant you were safe. Safe from what? Marcus demanded. Safe from having a mother who loved me? Safe from having your life destroyed by a custody battle that would have lasted years, David interjected. Safe from being caught in the middle of a war between your parents. Safe from having to choose sides every time we disagreed about something. So instead, you made the choice for me, Marcus said. You decided I was better off thinking she was dead than having to deal with complicated feelings about divorce. David opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because Marcus was right. That's exactly what he'd done. He'd looked at his 7-year-old son and decided that the clean break of death would be easier than the messy reality of shared custody and visitation schedules and all the ways Elena might have continued to be part of Marcus's life. I was trying to protect you, he said lamely. From what? Marcus repeated. From love? From having two parents who cared about me, even if they couldn't live together anymore. Elena watched her son confront his father and felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. This was the boy she'd dreamed about for 5 years, the child she'd wondered about every single day. He was braver than she'd ever been, more honest than either of his parents, and wise in ways that made her chest ache with love and regret. Marcus, she said quietly, your father isn't wrong that it would have been complicated. Divorce is hard on kids. Custody battles can be traumatic, maybe. Stop, Marcus interrupted. Stop making excuses for him. Stop making excuses for yourself. You're both adults. You both made choices. And those choices hurt me more than any stupid custody arrangement ever could have. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Elena and David both stared at their son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as a child to be protected from difficult truths, but as a person whose feelings and opinions mattered, a person who had been profoundly shaped by their decisions, who deserved better than the half-truths and manipulations they'd both been guilty of. What do you want? Elena asked finally. What do you want from me? From us? Marcus considered the question seriously, and Elena could see him thinking it through with the same intensity David brought to his business deals. When he finally answered, his voice was steady and sure. I want the truth, he said. All of it. No more lies, no more protecting me from things you think I can't handle. I want to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and what happens now. David and Elena exchanged a look, the first real communication they'd had in 5 years. In that glance was a recognition that their son had grown beyond their expectations, that he deserved better than the careful stories they'd constructed to manage his emotions. Okay, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth. She took a deep breath, looking around the park that had been her second home for the past 8 months. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was finally going to tell her son the truth in the place where she'd been living as a shadow of herself, invisible to everyone except the other forgotten people society had discarded. The truth is that your father and I should never have gotten married, she began. We loved each other, but we wanted fundamentally different things. For ourselves, for you, for our family. And instead of learning how to compromise, we both dug in our heels and fought about everything. Marcus settled back onto the bench beside her, and Elena's heart leaped at the simple gesture. He was choosing to stay, choosing to listen, choosing to be near her despite everything that had been revealed. When I lost my job at Roosevelt Elementary, she continued, things got much worse between us. The school district was cutting budgets, and as one of the newer teachers, I was let go. Your father started talking about how I wasn't providing stability, how you needed more structure than I could give you when I was struggling just to find new employment. And he wasn't wrong. I was scared, overwhelmed, barely keeping my head above water financially. David shifted uncomfortably, recognizing his own words being reflected back at him. But he didn't interrupt. He'd promised Marcus the truth, and the truth included acknowledging his own role in Elena's struggles. So, when your father suggested that he take primary custody, Elena said, I agreed. I thought it was temporary, that I'd get back on my feet and we'd figure out a way to share time with you fairly. But then I met someone. She glanced at David, who was staring at the ground with his hands clenched at his sides. His name was Michael Rodriguez, Elena continued. He worked at the Riverside Community Center, helping kids with their homework after school, running programs for families who couldn't afford other childcare options. He was kind and patient, and he made me feel like maybe I wasn't a complete failure as a person. When I introduced him to you, do you remember what you said? Marcus shook his head, but Elena could see recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. You said he was the funniest grown-up you'd ever met. You said you liked how he actually listened when you talked about your Pokemon cards instead of just pretending to pay attention. You asked if he could come to your school play because you wanted him to see you as the narrator. The memory hit Marcus like a physical force. He'd been 7, still young enough to accept new people in his life easily, still hopeful that maybe his parents could find a way to be happy, even if they couldn't be happy together. Michael had been tall and gentle, with kind eyes and a laugh that made Marcus feel important and heard. He'd only met him a handful of times before his mother suddenly disappeared, but he remembered liking him, remembered feeling safe around him. What happened to him? Marcus asked quietly. Elena looked at David again, waiting to see if he would answer. When he remained silent, she continued, Your father had him investigated, hired a private detective to dig into Michael's background, looking for anything that could be used against him. He found out that Michael had been arrested as a teenager for getting into a fight at a party. Nothing serious, just stupid adolescent behavior. But your father used it to argue that I was putting you in danger by dating him. That's not how it happened, David said quietly. Then tell him how it happened, Elena challenged. David looked at his son, seeing the expectation in his eyes, the demand for honesty they'd both promised him. The truth was uglier than Elena's version, but it was what Marcus had asked for. I hired a private investigator to look into Michael's background, David admitted. I found out about the arrest, yes, but I also found out other things that made me believe he might not be safe around children. Eleanor's head snapped up. What things? He'd been fired from a previous job working with kids, David said. There were allegations, nothing proven, nothing that resulted in charges, but allegations nonetheless. I couldn't take the risk. What kind of allegations? Elena pressed, her voice tight with growing anger. David looked away. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me, Elena said fiercely. You destroyed my relationship and used it to take my son away from me. I think I have a right to know what you thought you were protecting him from. The silence stretched between them, and Marcus could see his father struggling with something significant. When David finally spoke, his voice was so quiet they had to strain to hear him. There weren't any allegations, he admitted. I made that up. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. What? I hired the investigator to find something, anything I could use against Michael. When he came back with nothing more serious than a teenage misdemeanor from 15 years ago, I embellished. I told the investigator to write a report that would make Michael look dangerous, unstable, potentially harmful to children. You lied, Eleanor said, her voice flat with shock. You manufactured evidence to make my boyfriend look like a predator. David nodded miserably. I was desperate. I couldn't stand the thought of another man raising my son. I couldn't stand that Marcus might love him, might see him as a father figure. I couldn't stand the possibility that you might build a new family that didn't include me. Marcus stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the heroic figure he'd built up in his mind, not the perfect parent who'd saved him from an irresponsible mother, but a man who'd been so consumed by jealousy and possessiveness that he'd destroyed lives to get what he wanted. "So you had Mom taken away based on lies," Marcus said slowly. "I had her served with a restraining order," David corrected. "She wasn't arrested initially, but the judge believed the evidence I presented, and he agreed that Elena was making poor choices that put you at risk. Choices that you completely fabricated," Marcus pointed out. David nodded again, unable to look at either his son or his ex-wife. Elena felt 5 years of carefully suppressed anger, beginning to bubble up inside her. All this time, she'd believed that maybe David had been right, that maybe she had been putting Marcus at risk by dating Michael. She'd carried the guilt of that, the fear that her poor judgment had cost her the right to be a mother. But it had all been lies, fabrications designed to take away the only good thing that had happened to her after their divorce. "I fought the restraining order," she said, her voice getting stronger. "I hired a lawyer, even though I could barely afford it. But every time we got close to proving that the allegations were false, David's lawyers would produce new evidence. Witnesses who swore they'd seen Michael behaving inappropriately with children, documents that showed a pattern of concerning behavior. All fake," David whispered. "All fake," Elena confirmed. "But I didn't know that at the time. After 6 months of legal battles that were bankrupting me, my lawyer sat me down and explained the reality. David had resources I didn't have. He could keep this up indefinitely, and even if I eventually won, the process would take years, years during which Marcus would be caught in the middle, watching his parents tear each other apart in court." Marcus absorbed this information, trying to process the magnitude of what his father had done. Not just the lies, but the systematic destruction of his mother's life and their family's chance at finding a new kind of happiness. "So you gave up," he said to Elena, and there was no judgment in his voice, just a 12-year-old trying to understand why the adults in his life had made the choices they did. "I gave up the legal fight," Elena clarified, "but I didn't give up on you. I tried everything I could think of to maintain some kind of contact. I showed up at your school once just to catch a glimpse of you during recess. Your father had me arrested for violating the restraining order." David's face flushed with shame. He remembered that day, the call from the school principal, the panic he'd felt when he realized Elena was that desperate to see Marcus. Instead of recognizing it as a mother's love, he'd seen it as confirmation that she was unstable, potentially dangerous. "I wrote you letters," Elena continued, looking directly at Marcus. "Hundreds of them. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, just random thoughts about my day and how much I missed you. I kept them all in a storage box, hoping someday I'd be able to give them to you." "Where are they now?" Marcus asked, his voice small. Elena gestured vaguely around the park. "Somewhere in a storage facility I couldn't afford to keep paying for, along with most of the things I owned before I ended up here." The casual way she mentioned her homelessness hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mother who used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and sing off-key lullabies and help him build blanket forts in the living room, had been living on the streets. While he'd been growing up in a comfortable suburban home with every advantage money could buy, she'd been fighting just to survive. "How long have you been homeless?" he asked quietly. Elena hesitated, clearly not wanting to burden him with the full scope of her struggles. But she'd promised him the truth, and the truth included the consequences of David's actions and her own choices. "About 3 years," she said. "I managed to keep working for a while after the custody battle ended. I found a job at a private tutoring center, but the pay was much less than what I'd made as a teacher. When the legal fees had wiped out my savings and I couldn't find steady, full-time employment, I lost my apartment. I've been moving around ever since." Marcus turned to stare at his father, who looked like he might be physically ill. "You knew, didn't you?" You knew she was homeless. David nodded reluctantly. I had the investigator keep tabs on her movements. I told myself it was to make sure she wasn't trying to contact you, but really, I think I just wanted to know that my choices had consequences for her, that she was paying for what I saw as her betrayal of our family. Her betrayal, Marcus's voice rose with incredulity. She fell in love with someone after your marriage ended. That's not betrayal. That's a person trying to move on with their life and find happiness. I know that now, David said miserably, but at the time I felt like she was replacing us, replacing our family with something new that didn't include me. I couldn't stand it. Elena watched the exchange between father and son with a mixture of pain and pride. Pain at seeing Marcus grapple with such adult concepts at 12 years old. Pride at the young man he was becoming despite everything that had been done to him. There's something else, she said quietly. Something you both need to know. David and Marcus both turned to look at her, and Elena felt her resolve waver. This last truth was the hardest one to tell, the one that would change how they both saw the past 5 years. I never stopped trying to find a way back to you, she said to Marcus. Even after I accepted that the legal system wouldn't help me, even after I lost everything else, I never stopped believing that someday I'd figure out how to be your mother again. She reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a small, battered notebook held together with rubber bands. I've been documenting everything. Every time I saw you from a distance, every milestone I missed, every day I wanted to risk everything just to hug you one more time. Marcus stared at the notebook, recognizing it as proof of something he'd never dared to hope for, that his mother had never forgotten him, never stopped loving him, never truly abandoned him even when she couldn't be with him. You've been watching me? He asked, his voice filled with wonder rather than concern. Not watching in a creepy way, Elena said quickly. Not stalking or anything invasive, but this is a small town, and when you've been living on the streets for 3 years, you learn where people go, what their routines are, when they're most likely to be in certain places. I knew what school you attended, what time classes ended, what route you usually took walking home. The revelation that his mother had been so close for so long, without him knowing, left Marcus feeling disoriented in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. How many times had she seen him without him realizing? How many opportunities had there been for them to reconnect, if only he'd known to look for her? 8 months ago, Eleanor continued, I started deliberately positioning myself along your walking route to school, not to approach you. I knew that would only make things worse for everyone, but just to see you, to watch you grow up from a distance since I couldn't be part of your life directly. David felt sick. For 8 months, Elena had been right there, and he'd known it. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman he paid to discreetly keep an eye on Marcus's route to school, had mentioned the homeless woman who sat in the park each morning. David had even driven by a few times to make sure it wasn't Elena, but she'd looked so different, so thin, so weathered, so beaten down by circumstances, that he'd convinced himself it was just another unfortunate person society had failed. But deep down, in a place he hadn't wanted to acknowledge, he'd known it was her, and he'd done nothing to help her. Worse, he'd felt a twisted satisfaction in seeing how far she'd fallen, how completely his actions had destroyed her life. I saw you every school day for 8 months, Eleanor said to Marcus, and every day I had to fight the urge to call out to you, to risk everything, just to hear you say my name one more time. This morning when you looked at me, really looked at me, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't keep hiding. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd learned. His father had systematically destroyed his mother's life based on manufactured evidence and jealous possessiveness. His mother had been alive and homeless for years, watching him from a distance but never approaching because she'd been led to believe it was better for him. His entire life had been built on a foundation of deception and manipulation. But underneath all of that, there was something else, something that made his chest feel tight with emotions he didn't have names for. "You've been protecting me," he said suddenly, looking at Elena with new understanding. "All this time, you've been protecting me from the truth about Dad." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want you to have to choose between us. I didn't want you to know that your father was capable of the things he did. You deserve to have at least one parent you could trust completely, even if that meant sacrificing my own relationship with you. But that meant sacrificing yourself," Marcus pointed out. "You let everyone think you were a bad mother who abandoned her family, rather than tell people what Dad really did." Elena nodded. "Your happiness and stability were more important than my reputation. They were more important than anything." The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For 5 years, he'd carried the weight of believing his mother had chosen to leave him, but she hadn't left at all. She'd been forced away, and then she'd spent years protecting him from the knowledge of how cruel and calculated that forcing had been. "You're a good mom," he said quietly, and Elena felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "I don't know about that," she said through her tears. "A good mom would have found a way to stay in your life. A good mom would have fought harder, been smarter, done something different. A good mom would have put her child's well-being above her own need to be vindicated," Marcus said, surprising both his parents with his insight. "Which is exactly what you did." David watched this exchange and felt the full weight of what he'd destroyed settling on his shoulders. Not just Eleanor's life, not just Marcus's childhood innocence, but something precious and irreplaceable. The bond between a mother and son that should have been allowed to grow and evolve naturally over the years. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry to both of you. What I did was unforgivable." Marcus turned to look at his father, studying his face with the same intensity he'd inherited from both his parents. "Do you mean that? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" The question was brutally direct, and David had to respect his son's refusal to accept easy platitudes. Marcus deserved a real answer, even if it wasn't the one that would make David look better. "Both," David said honestly. "I'm sorry I got caught because it means you now have to deal with the consequences of my actions when you should have been protected from this kind of adult ugliness. But I'm also genuinely sorry for what I did. I've been sorry for years, but I was too much of a coward to admit it, even to myself." "Why now?" Marcus asked. "Why admit it now when you could have just sent Mom away again and told me I was imagining things?" David looked at Elena, then back at his son. "Because looking at you both right now, I realized that my choices didn't just hurt her. They hurt you too. All these years, I thought I was protecting you from pain, but I was actually causing you a different kind of pain. The pain of growing up believing your mother didn't love you enough to stay." Marcus nodded slowly. "I used to wonder what I did wrong, what made her want to leave. I thought maybe if I'd been a better kid, if I'd gotten better grades or caused fewer problems, she might have wanted to keep being my mom." The admission devastated both parents. Elena reached out instinctively, then stopped herself, still uncertain of her right to comfort him. David looked stricken, realizing that his protective lies had created exactly the kind of psychological damage he'd been trying to prevent. "You didn't do anything wrong," Elena said fiercely. "Not a single thing. You were perfect then and you're perfect now, and if I could go back and change everything—" "But you can't," Marcus interrupted, not unkindly. "None of us can change what happened. So the question is, what happens now?" The three of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about possible futures. Around them, the park was beginning to fill with the usual afternoon crowd. Kids getting out of school, parents pushing, strollers, teenagers hanging out by the basketball courts. Normal life continuing, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis for three people sitting on a bench. "I don't know," Elena said finally. "I honestly don't know what happens now. The restraining order is still in effect technically. Your father could have me arrested just for talking to you." David's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to have you arrested." "But you could," Elena pointed out. "You could decide tomorrow that This was a mistake, that Marcus is better off without me in his life, and you could make me disappear again. The power dynamic hasn't changed just because the truth came out. The power imbalance was still there, still real, despite everything that had been revealed. David still had money, connections, the ability to shape narratives in his favor. Elena still had nothing but the truth, and the truth didn't always win in legal proceedings. "What if you stayed?" Marcus asked suddenly, looking at his mother with desperate hope. "What if you came home with us?" Elena's heart leaped at the suggestion, but she forced herself to be realistic. "Baby, it's not that simple. I don't have a job, a place to live, anything to offer you materially. And your father and I have a lot of hurt between us that won't just disappear overnight." "I have plenty of money," David said quietly. "Enough to help you get back on your feet. Enough to make up for some of what you've lost because of my actions." Both Elena and Marcus stared at him in surprise. "You'd do that?" Elena asked suspiciously. "After everything you did to destroy my life, you'd actually help me rebuild it?" David looked at his hands, thinking about the man he'd become over the past 5 years. The successful businessman who'd won at all costs. The father who'd convinced himself that controlling his son's environment was the same as loving him. The ex-husband who'd felt justified in his cruelty because he'd been hurt and threatened. "I owe you that much," he said. "I owe you both that much. It's the least I can do to try to make amends for what I've done." "It's not about what you owe us," Marcus said firmly. "It's about what's right. And what's right is for us to try to be a family again. Maybe not the same kind of family we were before, but some kind of family that actually works." Elena felt a surge of hope so powerful it was almost painful. For 5 years, she'd dreamed of this moment, but she'd never dared to believe it could actually happen. The idea that she might get to be Marcus's mother again, that she might have a future beyond mere survival, was almost too much to process without falling apart completely. "There would have to be conditions," David said, and Elena's hope immediately tempered with caution. "Legal protections for everyone involved, counseling for Marcus to help him process everything that's happened, probably family therapy for all of us to figure out how to navigate this new reality." "I can live with conditions," Elena said carefully, "as long as they're fair and reasonable, as long as they're not designed to gradually push me out again when things get complicated or uncomfortable." "They won't be," David promised. "I'm done making unilateral decisions about this family. I'm done thinking I know what's best for everyone without actually consulting anyone." Marcus looked between his parents, seeing them really communicate for the first time in his memory. Not fighting, not manipulating, just two adults trying to figure out how to do better by the child they both loved. "There's something else we need to talk about," he said. "Michael." Elena blinked in surprise. She'd honestly forgotten about Michael in the emotional upheaval of the past hour. But Marcus was right. He was part of this story too, part of the truth that had been hidden for so long. "What about him?" David asked, tension creeping back into his voice despite his best efforts. "Do you still have feelings for him?" Marcus asked his mother directly. "If you could contact him now, would you want to?" Elena considered the question seriously. Michael had been important to her, had represented hope and healing during one of the darkest periods of her life. But that had been 5 years ago, and she was a fundamentally different person now. They both were. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I loved him, or thought I did, but I don't know if that was real love or just gratitude for being treated with kindness when I felt completely worthless. I don't even know if he'd want to hear from me after everything that happened, after the way I just disappeared from his life without explanation. But you might want to find out," Marcus pressed gently. "Someday." Elena nodded slowly. "Maybe, eventually, when I've figured out who I am again, what I want my life to look like going forward." David felt the familiar stab of jealousy, but this time he recognized it for what it was. Fear of being replaced, of not being enough, of losing control over the people he loved most. The same fear that had driven him to destroy his family 5 years ago. "If you want to contact him," David said carefully, the words clearly costing him something to say. "I won't try to stop you. You have the right to have relationships with people who make you happy, who treat you well." The words were clearly difficult for him, but Marcus noticed that he said them anyway. Maybe his father really was capable of change after all. "Right now," Elena said, "I'm not ready for any relationship except the one with my son. If that's something you want," she added, looking at Marcus with uncertainty. "It's what I've wanted for 5 years," Marcus said simply. "Even when I thought it was impossible. Even when I thought wanting it made me crazy or disloyal to Dad's memory of you." Elena felt tears starting again, but these were different from the tears she'd cried earlier. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope for a future she'd thought was lost forever. "So, what do we do first?" she asked. "Practically speaking, I mean. I can't just show up at your house. I assume the neighbors think I'm dead too." David winced, realizing there would be a whole community of people who would need explanations. Teachers who had comforted Marcus after his mother's death. Neighbors who had brought casseroles during their time of grief. Friends who had helped David raise Marcus as a supposedly single father. "We figure it out together," Marcus said firmly. "All 3 of us. We tell the truth. Maybe not all at once, but we tell the truth, and we deal with whatever consequences come from that." Eleanor looked at her son with wonder. When had he become so wise? When had he developed the kind of emotional maturity that she and David had clearly lacked throughout their marriage and divorce? "You know," she said, "you turned out pretty amazing, despite everything we put you through." Marcus smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him all morning. "I had a good mom," he said. "She taught me about love and forgiveness and fighting for what matters. I just forgot for a while that she was still teaching me, even when she couldn't be there." Elena reached out then, unable to stop herself, and Marcus didn't pull away. She touched his face gently, the way she used to when he was small and had nightmares, the way she'd dreamed of doing for 5 long years. "I love you," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. Not for a single moment." "I love you too, Mom," Marcus said, and Elena felt the pieces of her broken heart start to come back together. David watched the reunion of mother and son and felt something shift inside his own chest. The jealousy was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else. Relief. Relief that Marcus would finally have what David had never been able to give him, the certainty that both his parents loved him unconditionally, even if they couldn't always be together. "Where do we start?" David asked quietly. Eleanor and Marcus looked at him, and he saw forgiveness beginning to bloom in their eyes. Not complete forgiveness. That would take time, work, proof that he could be the man they needed him to be, but the possibility of forgiveness, which was more than he deserved and more than he dared to hope for. "We start by getting you somewhere safe to live," Marcus said to Elena. "Somewhere warm and clean where you can take a shower and sleep in a real bed and not have to worry about where your next meal is coming from." "Marcus," Elena said gently, "your father might be willing to help financially, but that doesn't mean we can just move back in together. There's a lot of hurt between us, a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt before we can even think about being in the same house again." "I know," Marcus said, "but there are apartments, right? Places you could live that aren't the street but aren't our house either. Places where I could visit you and we could spend time together without it being weird for anyone." David nodded. "I can help with that. First month's rent, security deposit, furniture, whatever you need to get started again. It's the least I can do." Elena looked at him suspiciously. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing," David said, and was surprised to realize he meant it completely. "I want nothing in return except the chance to prove that I can be better than I was, that I can be the kind of father Marcus deserves and the kind of ex-husband you should have had from the beginning." "That's going to take more than money," Elena pointed out. "I know," David said, "but it's a start, and right now, a start is all I can offer." Marcus looked between his parents and felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years, genuine hope for the future. Not the desperate hope of a child wishing for impossible things, but the mature hope of someone who understood that healing was possible, that families could be rebuilt even after they'd been completely shattered. "There's one more thing," he said. "The letters you wrote me. The ones in storage. I want to read them, all of them." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I'll see what I can do about getting them back. The storage company might have auctioned off the unit by now, but it's worth trying." "I'll help," David offered, "whatever it costs." "It's not about the money," Elena said. "It's about whether they're even still there. Storage companies auction off units when people can't pay. Everything I saved from my old life might be gone forever." Marcus felt a flash of panic at the thought that his mother's letters, proof of her love, evidence that she'd never forgotten him, might have been lost forever. "But if they're gone," Elena continued, "I can write new ones. I remember most of what I wanted to say anyway. I had 5 years to think about it, to imagine what I would tell you if I ever got the chance." "You'd do that?" Marcus asked. "I'd do anything for you," Elena said simply. "That's what mothers do. That's what love means." David felt the truth of that statement hit him like a physical blow. Elena would do anything for Marcus, including disappearing from his life when she believed it was best for him, including living on the streets for 3 years rather than create conflict that might hurt him, including protecting David's reputation even when it cost her everything. Meanwhile, David had convinced himself that controlling Marcus's environment was the same as loving him, that winning at all costs was justified if it meant getting his way. He'd been so wrong about everything. "Elena," he said quietly, "can you ever forgive me?" Elena looked at the man she'd once loved, the father of her child, the person who had caused her more pain than anyone else in her life. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes, real recognition of the harm he'd caused. But she also saw something else, fear that he was too broken to be fixed, too selfish to really change. "Ask me again in a year," she said, "after I've seen whether you can actually follow through on all these promises you're making, after I've seen whether you're really committed to being better, or if this is just guilt talking because you got caught." David nodded, accepting the condition. A year seemed both impossibly long and remarkably generous under the circumstances. "But David," Elena continued, "I will work with you to co-parent Marcus. Not because I forgive you, but because he deserves to have both his parents in his life if that's what he wants. We don't have to be friends. We don't have to like each other. But we have to be adults who put our son's needs first." "I can do that," David said. "I want to do that. I want to learn how to do that properly." Marcus looked at his parents and felt proud of them both. His mother for her strength and grace under impossible circumstances. His father for finally admitting his mistakes and committing to change. Neither of them was perfect, but they were both trying, and that was enough to build on. "So," he said, standing up from the bench where this whole conversation had started, "should we go figure out how to get Mom an apartment?" Elena laughed, a sound of pure joy that she hadn't made in years. "Just like that? We're really doing this?" "Just like that," Marcus confirmed. "Unless you have somewhere else you need to be." Eleanor looked around the park that had been her second home for 8 months, at the bench where she'd sat every day watching for glimpses of her son. She thought about the other homeless individuals who had become her community, the shelter workers who had shown her kindness, the social workers who had tried to help her navigate systems designed to keep people like her invisible. "I do have somewhere I need to be," she said. "I need to go tell some people that my life just changed completely, that I'm not going to be at the shelter tonight, that I won't need the meal at the community center. They've been my family for the past few years. They deserve to know that I'm okay." Marcus nodded, understanding instinctively that his mother would want to honor the relationships that had sustained her during her darkest time. "Can we come with you? I'd like to meet the people who took care of my mum when I couldn't." Elena felt her heart swell with love for this boy who was so much better than either of his parents had any right to expect. "I'd like that very much." David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of visiting homeless shelters and community centers. But then, he saw the expectant looks on both Elena's and Marcus's faces, and he realized this was part of his education in becoming a better person. "Lead the way," he said, as they walked away from the park together. Not quite a family yet, but not strangers anymore either. Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years, the sense that she was exactly where she belonged. Not because her circumstances had changed dramatically, though they had, but because she was with the person who mattered most to her in the world. "Mum," Marcus said as they walked, and Elena's heart jumped every time he said the word. "What's the first thing you want to do when you get your apartment?" Elena considered the question seriously. There were so many practical things she needed: clothes that fit properly, a real bed, a kitchen where she could cook meals, a bathroom where she could shower in privacy. But when she answered, her voice was soft with wonder. "I want to make you pancakes," she said. "The dinosaur-shaped ones you used to love, and I want to hear about everything I missed, every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday that made up the last 5 years of your life." "That's going to take a while," Marcus warned her. Elena smiled, linking her arm through his as they walked down the street toward whatever came next. "I have time," she said. "For the first time in 5 years, I have all the time in the world." Behind them, David pulled out his phone and cancelled his afternoon meetings. He had time too, and he was finally going to use it for what mattered most: learning how to be the father and ex-husband his family deserved. The story of Marcus Thompson and his parents was far from over. There would be difficult conversations ahead, legal proceedings to sort out, therapy sessions to navigate, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered. There would be setbacks and arguments and moments when all three of them wondered if they were making the right choice. But for now, in this moment, they were walking together toward a future none of them had dared to imagine. A future where love hadn't died after all, where families could be rebuilt from the ashes of their destruction, and where sometimes the most impossible dreams were just dreams that hadn't found their time yet. And in a small park on Elm Street, the bench where Elena had spent 8 months watching for her son sat empty for the first time in months, no longer needed for its vigil of hope that had finally, against all odds, been rewarded. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the kitchen of her small one-bedroom apartment, mixing pancake batter with the same concentrated attention she'd once given to lesson plans. The apartment wasn't much, a modest space in a converted Victorian house on the east side of town, but it was hers, clean, safe, warm, and most importantly, a place where Marcus could visit her, without anyone questioning whether she had the right to call herself his mother. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the small dining table where Marcus sat doing homework while keeping up a steady stream of conversation about his day at school. It was a scene Elena had dreamed about for 5 years, so ordinary and perfect that sometimes she had to stop what she was doing just to convince herself it was real. "Mrs. Peterson said my history report was the best in the class," Marcus was saying, his pencil moving steadily across his math worksheet. "She asked if I wanted to present it to the 7th grade classes too." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Elena said, adding vanilla to the batter. "What was your topic again?" "The Underground Railroad. I focused on the letters that escaped slaves wrote to family members they'd left behind, how they kept hope alive even when they couldn't be together." Elena paused in her stirring, struck by the parallels in her son's choice of subject matter. Even at 12, Marcus was processing their family story through the lens of separation, hope, and reunion. "That sounds like a powerful presentation," she said carefully. "Yeah, I think people don't really understand how love can survive even when everything else is falling apart," Marcus said, looking up from his homework with eyes that seemed far too wise for his age. "Like, just because people can't be together doesn't mean they stop caring about each other." Elena felt her heart clench with love and pride, and a deep sadness for all the innocence her son had lost. But there was something else there too. Resilience, wisdom, a capacity for empathy that had been forged in the fire of his own loss. "You're going to help a lot of people understand that," she said. "Your words, your perspective, they matter, Marcus. Don't forget that." The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their conversation, followed by David's familiar knock. 3 short raps, then 2 longer ones. A pattern they'd established so Elena would know it was him and not have to worry about unexpected visitors. "Dad's here," Marcus announced, already closing his textbook and gathering his papers. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that still accompanied David's visits. 3 weeks of tentative co-parenting hadn't erased 5 years of hurt and mistrust, but they were learning to navigate their new reality with careful politeness and a shared commitment to Marcus's well-being. "Come in," Elena called out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. David entered the kitchen, carrying a small bag from the local hardware store and wearing the slightly uncomfortable expression he always had when entering Elena's space. He'd paid for the apartment, the furniture, the security deposit, but he was careful never to act as if that gave him any ownership or control over her life. "Morning, Elena." "Hey, buddy," he said, ruffling Marcus's hair. "Ready for that baseball game?" "Almost," Marcus said. "Mom's making dinosaur pancakes for breakfast. Want some?" The casual way Marcus moved between his parents, including David in Elena's space, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, still amazed both adults. He'd adapted to their new arrangement with a flexibility that made Elena grateful and heartbroken in equal measure. "I don't want to intrude," David said, glancing at Elena uncertainly. "It's fine," Elena said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "There's plenty of batter. Marcus, can you set another place?" As Marcus busied himself with plates and silverware, David approached the counter where Elena was working. "I brought that deadbolt you mentioned," he said, holding up the hardware store bag. "If you want, I can install it after breakfast." "You don't have to do that," Elena said automatically. "I know," David replied, "but I want to. I want you to feel safe here." There was something in his voice that made Eleanor look at him more closely. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd watched David struggle with his new role in their family dynamic. He was trying to be supportive without being controlling, helpful without being presumptuous, present without being intrusive. It couldn't be easy for someone who'd spent 5 years orchestrating every aspect of Marcus's life. "Thank you," she said simply. "That would be helpful." They ate breakfast together in an atmosphere that was becoming increasingly comfortable. Marcus chattering about school while his parents learned to interact as allies rather than adversaries. It wasn't the family Eleanor had once imagined, but it was something new and potentially beautiful if they could all learn to trust it. "Oh, I forgot to mention," David said as he helped clear the dishes. "I heard back from that private investigator about the storage unit." Eleanor froze, her heart jumping into her throat. "And the unit's still there. Your belongings are still there. The company had been sending notices to your old address, but when they couldn't reach you, they decided to hold on to everything rather than auction it off. Something about the employee who processed your account having been through homelessness herself." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. After 3 years of assuming everything from her old life was gone forever, the possibility of recovering. Those letters, hundreds of them, written to Marcus during the darkest period of her life, seemed almost too good to be true. "When can we go get them?" Marcus asked eagerly. "Whenever you want," David said. "I've already paid the back fees. The unit is yours again." Elena stared at him in shock. "You paid 3 years of storage fees." "It was the least I could do," David said quietly. "Those letters, your things, I'm the reason you lost access to them in the first place." The gesture was so unexpectedly thoughtful that Elena had to turn away to compose herself. 3 weeks ago, she would have been suspicious of David's motives, but she was beginning to believe that his remorse was genuine, that his commitment to making amends was real. "Can we go today?" Marcus asked. "After the baseball game?" If that's what you want, Elena said. I really want to read those letters, Mom. I want to know what you were thinking about during all those years when I thought you were gone. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The idea of Marcus reading those letters, raw, unfiltered expressions of love and loss and desperate hope, was both thrilling and terrifying. They would show him how much she'd missed him, but they would also reveal the depth of her pain, her anger at David, her moments of despair and self-doubt. They might be hard to read, she warned. I wasn't in a good place when I wrote them. Some of them are pretty sad. I can handle sad, Marcus said, with a maturity that continued to astound her. I've been handling sad for 5 years. At least now, I'll understand why. After breakfast, David and Marcus left for the baseball game, a weekly tradition they'd maintained, even as their family configuration changed. Elena used the quiet time to shower and get dressed, to call the community center and let them know she wouldn't need a meal that day, to slowly adjust to the reality that her life had structure and predictability. Again, at 3 o'clock, David's BMW pulled up outside her apartment building, and Eleanor watched through her front window as father and son got out of the car, both of them animated and happy from their afternoon together. Marcus was carrying a small trophy, apparently from some kind of contest at the game. "Mom, look!" he called out as soon as he entered her apartment. "Dad and I won the father-son throwing competition." Elena felt a complex mix of emotions at the announcement. Joy, that Marcus had experienced that kind of simple happiness with his father. A sharp pang of sadness that she'd missed it. And underneath it all, a growing recognition that David wasn't the villain she'd cast him as for 5 years. He was a flawed man who'd made terrible choices, but he was also a father who loved his son and was trying to do better. "That's wonderful," she said, accepting Marcus's enthusiastic hug. "I'm so proud of you both." "Ready to go to the storage place?" David asked. The drive across town was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they might find in that small, concrete unit. Elena hadn't seen her belongings in 3 years, hadn't even thought about most of them. But the letters were different. The letters had been her lifeline, her way of staying connected to Marcus, even when connection was forbidden. The storage facility was exactly as sterile and depressing as Elena remembered. Long rows of identical metal doors, each one hiding someone's abandoned or forgotten possessions. David had the key and the access code, and he opened Unit 47 with the ceremonial gravity of someone unlocking a time capsule. Inside, Elena's old life was waiting for her. Boxes of teaching materials, carefully labeled and organized. Her good dishes wrapped in newspaper. Photo albums documenting Marcus's early years and their family's happy moments. Winter clothes she hadn't worn in 3 years. And in the back corner, a large plastic storage container marked "Letters for Marcus" in Elena's careful handwriting. Marcus approached the container with something approaching reverence, running his fingers over his mother's handwriting on the label. "There are really hundreds of them?" he asked. 437, Elena said. "I counted them each time I added a new one." David helped them load the most important boxes into his car, but it was Marcus who carefully carried the container of letters, cradling it like the treasure it was. When they got back to Elena's apartment, he set it on her dining table and looked at it expectantly. "Can I read them now?" he asked. Elena felt a surge of panic. Those letters contained 5 years of raw emotion, uncensored thoughts about David, moments of despair when she'd questioned every choice she'd made. They weren't meant to be read by anyone, especially not the 12-year-old child they were written to. "Maybe we should go through them." First," she said carefully, "some of them might be intense." "I want to read them all," Marcus said firmly. "Even the intense ones. Especially the intense ones. I need to know what you were really feeling, not some edited version that's supposed to protect me." Elena looked at David, who nodded slightly. Over the past 3 weeks, they'd both learned that Marcus could handle much more truth than they'd given him credit for. "Okay," Elena said, opening the container. "But we read them together, And if something is too hard or confusing, you tell me and we talk about it. The first letter was dated just 1 week after Elena had signed the custody agreement, before the restraining order, before the fake allegations, when she'd still believed this separation was temporary. "My dearest Marcus," Elena read aloud, "I know you don't understand why Mommy isn't living with you and Daddy anymore, but I need you to know that it has nothing to do with you. You are the most perfect, wonderful little boy in the world, and being your mum is the best thing I've ever done." As Elena read, her voice sometimes breaking with emotion, Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone finally hearing his own story told truthfully. Some letters were cheerful, full of hope that their separation would end soon. Others were desperate, written during Elena's darkest moments when she felt like she was disappearing from her own life. David sat quietly in Elena's living room, occasionally helping to read a letter when Elena's voice gave out, bearing witness to the pain his actions had caused. Every word was a reminder of what he'd destroyed, but also what they might still be able to rebuild. "This one's from my 8th birthday," Marcus said, holding up a letter with a small drawing of a dinosaur cake in the margin. "You remembered that I wanted a dinosaur party. I remembered everything," Elena said softly. "Every birthday, every lost tooth, every soccer game I missed. I wrote them all down because I couldn't bear the thought of forgetting a single detail of your life." "But you didn't forget," Marcus pointed out. "Even when you couldn't be there, you were paying attention. You were still being my mom." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but for once, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for this moment, for this boy, for the chance to finally share the love she'd been carrying alone for so long. "Read the one from Christmas 3 years ago," Marcus said, rifling through the letters. "I want to know what you were thinking about when I was opening presents and wishing you were there." As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them sat surrounded by the evidence of Elena's unwavering love, reading letter after letter, piecing together the story of a mother who'd never stopped being a mother, even when she couldn't act like one. "This one's different," Marcus said, holding up a letter from about 6 months ago. "It's not to me, it's to Dad." Elena's face went white. She'd forgotten about those letters, the ones she'd written to David but never sent, filled with anger and accusations and desperate pleas for the chance to see their son. "Marcus, maybe that's not—" David began. "No, I want to hear it," Marcus said. "I want to know what Mom really thought about what you did." Elena took the letter with shaking hands, recognizing her own handwriting made jagged by emotion. "David," she read, "it's been 4 years since you took my son away from me, and I still wake up every morning hoping this is all a nightmare. I see Marcus walking to school sometimes, and he's getting so tall, so grown up, and I want to scream at you for stealing these years from me. But then I watch him laugh with his friends, and I can see that he's happy, and I hate myself for being grateful that you've taken good care of him." The letter went on for 3 pages, cycling between rage and heartbreak and a grudging acknowledgement that David had provided Marcus with stability and love, even if his methods had been cruel. When Elena finished reading, the room was silent, except for the sound of traffic outside and the quiet tick of the wall clock. "You were angry," Marcus observed. "Yes," Elena said. "I was furious, for years. But you were also grateful that Dad was taking care of me." "Yes, that too. Both things were true at each the same time." Marcus considered this, processing the complexity of adult emotions with the same analytical approach he brought to his schoolwork. "I think that's what love looks like sometimes," he said finally. "Being angry at someone but still wanting them to be okay. Hating what they did but being glad they're good at the things you can't do." Both parents stared at their son, amazed once again by his wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" David asked. "I had good teachers," Marcus said, looking at both his parents. "I just had to learn to pay attention to what they were really teaching me, not just what they were saying out loud." As evening settled over the small apartment, Elena made dinner, While Marcus and David sorted through more of her belongings, the photo albums sparked conversations about memories Marcus had thought were lost forever. Eleanor's teaching materials led to discussions about her plans to return to education once she was more settled. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Elena said, as they sat around her small dining table sharing takeout Chinese food. "Getting my master's degree, maybe specializing in helping kids who've been through trauma." "That's a great idea," David said. "You were always gifted at connecting with children who were struggling." It was the first genuinely complimentary thing he'd said about her abilities in years, and Elena felt a small piece of the wall between them crumble. "I could help with tuition," David offered. "I know grad school is expensive." "I don't want your money for that," Elena said, but not harshly. "I need to do some things for myself, to prove to myself that I can rebuild my life independently." "I understand," David said, "but if you change your mind, the offer stands." As they cleaned up after dinner, Marcus made an announcement that surprised both his parents. "I want to stay here tonight," he said, "with Mom, if that's okay." Elena's heart leaped, but she looked at David uncertainly. They hadn't discussed overnight visits, hadn't established that kind of boundary yet. "I think that's a great idea," David said, and Elena could see the effort it cost him to say it. "I'll pick you up in the morning for school." "Actually," Marcus said, "I was thinking Mom could walk me to school if she wants to. It's not that far from here." Elena felt a rush of joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. The simple act of walking her son to school, something millions of parents did every day without thinking about it, represented a return to ordinary motherhood that she'd never thought she'd experience again. "I would love that," she said. After David left, Eleanor and Marcus settled on her small couch to read more letters. Some made them laugh. Eleanor's attempts to describe movies Marcus might enjoy, her speculation about whether he'd grown out of his dinosaur phase yet. Others made them both cry. Eleanor's letters, from the anniversary of the fake funeral, her desperate words about feeling like she was mourning a living child. "I'm sorry you went through that," Marcus said during one particularly painful letter. "I'm sorry you had to hurt like that because of me." "Not because of you," Elena corrected firmly. "Never because of you. Because of the situation, because of the choices adults made, but never because of you." "Sometimes I feel guilty for being happy," Marcus admitted. "Like when Dad and I would do fun things together. Part of me felt bad for enjoying it because I thought it meant I was forgetting about you." Elena pulled her son closer on the couch, marveling at the solid warmth of him, the reality of his presence after so many years of aching absence. "Being happy doesn't dishonor the people we miss," she said. "I would have been heartbroken if you'd spent 5 years being miserable. Your happiness was the only thing that made any of this bearable. Do you think we can be a real family again?" Marcus asked. "Not like before, but something new." Elena considered the question seriously. The three of them had so much work ahead of them, therapy sessions to navigate, legal issues to resolve, years of hurt and mistrust to slowly heal. David was trying to change, but change was a process, not an event. She was trying to rebuild her life, but some kinds of damage took years to repair. "I think we can be something," she said carefully. "I don't know exactly what it will look like, but I think we can figure out how to be a family that works for all of us." "Good," Marcus said, settling against her shoulder with the contentment of a child who finally felt secure. "That's all I really wanted, just to know that we're all trying." As Elena tucked her son into the small guest bed she'd set up in her living room, she felt a profound sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Not because her life was perfect. It was still complicated, still fragile, still full of uncertainties, but because she was Marcus's mother again, actively and daily, in all the small ways that mattered. "Mom," Marcus said as she turned out the light, "thank you for never giving up on me, even when it seemed impossible." "Thank you for recognizing me," Elena replied. "Even when I looked like a stranger." "You never looked like a stranger," Marcus said sleepily. "You always looked like my mom. I just had to remember how to see you." The next morning, Elena walked Marcus to school for the first time in 5 years, joining the stream of parents and children making their way through the neighborhood. Some people recognized her, the woman who used to teach at Roosevelt Elementary, who'd supposedly died in a car accident years ago. There would be questions, rumors, gossip to navigate, but Elena found she didn't care about any of that. She was walking her son to school. She was part of his daily routine again. She was visible in his world, not as a ghost or a memory, but as his living, breathing, present mother. At the school gates, Marcus hugged her goodbye with the unconscious ease of a child who knew his mother would be there when he got home. "See you after school, Mom," he said, shouldering his backpack. "See you after school, sweetheart," Elena replied, watching him walk into the building with his friends. As she walked back to her apartment, Elena passed the park where she'd sat for 8 months, watching and waiting and hoping for exactly this kind of ordinary morning. The bench was occupied by someone else now, another lost soul seeking solace in small routines and distant observations. Elena thought about stopping, about offering some word of encouragement or hope, but she decided against it. Some journeys had to be walked alone, and some hope had to be discovered rather than given. Instead, she continued home to her small apartment, where the dining table was, still covered with letters documenting 5 years of love that had never died, where the coffee was still warm and the morning light was streaming through windows that belonged to her, where the phone would ring later with a call from David, checking in and slowly learning how to be part of a family that didn't require his control to function, where Marcus's homework waited on the kitchen counter, a math worksheet with his careful handwriting solving problems with the same methodical attention Elena had taught him before the world fell apart and built itself back together in an entirely new configuration. It wasn't the life Elena had planned when Marcus was born, full of possibilities and simple dreams, but it was a good life, a real life, a life where love had survived the worst that fear and selfishness could throw at it. And for the first time in 5 years, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm of ordinary miracles, parents walking children to school, people falling in love, families finding their way back to each other despite everything that tried to keep them apart. The world was still full of pain and loss and impossible circumstances, but it was also full of hope and resilience and love that refused to die. Elena poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat down to read the rest of her letters to Marcus, not because she needed to remember anymore, but because some stories deserved to be told completely, even when they had already found their happy ending, especially then.